capital budget is funded with a dedicated charge that people can understand, and there's a conversation every year about what the rate's going to be, what the money's going to. When the projects are finished, that millage can go down. Meanwhile, the actual rate you pay for your services doesn't have to ping pong all over the place based on capital spending. So is there anybody in the room who's heard of a similar way of funding a water system? Because I just thought, yes, who does it like that? Chicago. Okay, and that's, you mentioned Chicago. But I think those are the only two places I've ever heard, and I just thought that was a wonderfully transparent way of doing this. Let's take a step back for a minute. Whichever of you want to react to this can react, but maybe you, Maureen. We've had 100 years of low water bills and providing great water. But in fact, we've arrived at a point in 2016 where the quote unquote business model, the way we pay for water, suddenly seems to be broken. In talking to the three of you before we got up here, I actually had a sort of a moment of revelation. I think the model for funding water has been broken for 100 years. We're only just noticing now. So how did we get ourselves into this spot where we're at D-, we're $3 trillion behind nationwide and what we need to spend? How did that happen?
Well, the Water Authority has only been around since 1944, so we don't have those 100 years.
Your water.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. In San Diego.
Yeah, so there's some advantage to that. I think that if there is not direct communication on an ongoing basis with your community about water, about what it takes to get water to the tap, you're going to end up behind the 8 ball no matter what. That this isn't just we need money, we need funding for a project, therefore we'll go out and sell the project. It's got to be in the totality of what our water needs are and what it takes to get the water to the tap 24/7. You know, there was a conversation on the earlier panel about communication and transparency and so forth. And I think that is the key to, I guess, unlocking this economic issue that water agencies are facing. In San Diego, we have spent over $3 billion in about under 20 years on infrastructure and supplies. And we did it with the support of our community, but that didn't come easily and it didn't come quickly. We had to have a vision. We had to explain that vision with clarity. And then we got the support of our community, our businesses, and the politicians.
Good.
And if I could, I mean, it's the same thing all over the country and actually the world. Water is the forgotten resource. The water infrastructure that we put in place when it was built with construction grants, the word G, grants that we got from the federal government, paid for the backbone of the system that we have now. There's no longer a granting mechanism out there. So we have this great infrastructure. It was built with great funding that came through the federal and state governments at that time and local. And now we've forgotten about it because every time you turn on the tap, the water works. When you flush the toilet, the water goes away and the rivers look okay. But then all of a sudden we get to the point, and some would say it's a tipping point, where you start seeing stressors on the environment, you start seeing droughts, you start seeing these problems with the water supply. And now it's all of a sudden becoming more of an issue. So it's a forgotten resource, and I think we just forgot about it, and now we're just waking up and saying we got to do something about it.
Well, and isn't it true? And maybe Patrick, you've looked at. So I probably didn't adequately introduce Patrick. Performance Solutions at Veolia is a kind of brilliant twist on the consulting model and the water efficiency model. You hire Patrick's division, they come in and look at how you run your water system, either on the operations side or on the capital spending side, but let's talk about operations for a minute. They make a series of recommendations in partnership with whatever water utility they're working with, and then they put them in binders but instead of putting them on a shelf and walking away with a check, they get paid based on what your water utility saves. As Patrick said, they stick around to see if they can actually make the efficiency improvements, if you can make the efficiency improvements with their help and guidance. So you've looked at lots of water systems and water budgets and operations financing. My sense is the sunk cost is just what Kevin said, is completely ignored. All we're doing is paying for the trucks and the men and women manning the computers and the electricity to pump the water, if we're paying for those things with the water. But you tell me.
Right. So, I mean, I'm not going to sit on a water and finance panel and say that money is not an issue for the water industry.
Good, thank you.
But I do think it's important to not just think about what is the supply of money into the water industry. It's also very important to think about getting the most value out of the money that we do have available. I'm not saying there's enough available, but there is money, and looking at the efficiency and looking at getting the most effective operations, the most efficient operations out of the money that is available, I think is, in the end, ties into the communication question that Maureen raised, because ultimately you earn the right and the trust of your customers to raise rates or to charge for the water that you're delivering by making sure you are providing the most efficient service that you can and providing high quality service to your customers. And from having looked at utilities in the US, but also globally, there certainly is money available in the system that is locked up in inefficiencies. And by thinking about how you
or even wasted, we could say.
And so I think thinking about inefficiencies as an additional source of money into water utilities to really upgrade the system and to maybe fill in some of the gaps that we have in terms of funding, I think is an important part of the conversation as well.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I think a lot of it has to do with leadership and courage.
Okay.
That's our problem.
What? A problem. It's a problem. But tell me, what does that mean?
I think if there is not that leadership and courage in the management of water systems, you will never fix the problem. If you are not courageous enough to be the truth teller, to have that transparency, to challenge the operations from an efficiency standpoint, to be willing to innovate, to be willing to try, even though you may fail, you're not going to get anywhere.
Okay. So
if you're not willing to lean into that discomfort, you know, if you're like, I'm a public employee, I'm here forever.
Be quiet, right? Yeah.
That's where the problem is. You know, if there's not asset management programs, if there isn't that willingness to go out on the limb to do what's needed, you will always have a finance.
Okay, so let's tell some stories, because I know you all have good stories. Maureen, you took over the San Diego Water Authority 20 years ago.
Right.
Came over from the city where you had been, if I recall correctly, assistant city manager. You took over in the middle of the last big drought or at the end of the last big drought. But tell us the story. You told me an interesting story about discovering that there was no reserve water supply for San Diego. For those of you who aren't familiar with how California works, maybe there aren't that many, the water moves from the north to the south. LA and San Diego, the two big municipalities that rely for much of their water on water that comes from the state water project from the north. All of that water could be cut off in 40 seconds in an earthquake. And the first time I had somebody in California talking to me about this, I said, oh, and then what would happen? Oh, then there'd be no water in Los Angeles or San Diego for 9 months. I said, no, that can't be right. What actually will happen? Oh, no, there's no plan. There'd just be no water. I mean, those guys would be kind of on their own. So tell us about that moment for you.
Right. Well, we had two ahas that really fundamentally shaped the Water Authority and our strategic plan. The first one was the tremendous drought in 1986 through 1991 in California. And we're used to droughts, but this was a whopper. And we ended up, at that time, 95% of all of our water was from a single supplier, with predominantly the source being the State Water Project in Sacramento area. And we took a cut. Our first big cut was over 30% of our water was cut from us. And then we were challenged pretty close to a couple months later, we were challenged with a notice we were going to be cut 50%.
Imagine what you would do without 30% of your water, ladies and gentlemen.
Our water, and this was at about 2 million people, our water was in major jeopardy. We had no other source. And so I was in the city of San Diego trying to do economic development, redevelopment, business attraction, business retention. You can imagine what was happening. Their first words were, Maureen, where's your water going to come from? How could we rely on expanding our business if you can't give us water? So when I moved over to the Water Authority, the first thing to do was to change that water supply portfolio from 95% dependent on a single supplier to a multifaceted. So our strategy was water reliability through diversification. Diversification of our supplies and diversification of our infrastructure to provide that. And we started. And we have invested over $3 billion since about 1995 to do a variety of things. Number one, our water supply portfolio is fully diversified and continuing to increase its diversification. We have water coming from Imperial Valley through an agriculture to urban water conservation and transfer program. We have lined earthen canals to conserve water. We have done recycling. We have tiny bits of groundwater, but we're using desalinating our tiny bit of groundwater. In December of last year, we opened up the first very large desalination plant, 50 million gallon per day desalination plant on our coast. And we are moving into water reuse and repurification. We are already over the yuck factor in our community, and we are heading straight to repurification as our next increment of water.
Okay, hang on one second. Let's just unpack two of those. The Imperial Valley Irrigation District, IID, which is adjacent to you guys, is actually the single most productive agricultural county, Imperial County, in the country.
Right.
They use the Imperial Irrigation District, the Imperial Valley Irrigation District, is entitled to 10 times the amount of water as the city of Las Vegas, and it's the same water. Now, what do? You use your ratepayers' money.
Right. We can pay more than farmers can pay for water. Farmers can't afford to invest in high technology on the farm. So what we do is we pay the district. They wanted to maintain their agricultural economy. That is their economy. We wanted to ensure that their yields could remain. So we pay money to basically install in their system and on-farm conservation, laser leveling, micro sprinklers, pump back systems, you name it, we've installed it. They are able to either maintain or increase their yields and use less water.
And you told me you're getting 100,000 acre feet.
100,000 from that alone.
100,000. She buys irrigation equipment in the Imperial Valley, and they let her keep the water.
Right.
That's interesting use of money. And then the canal that the water comes to the Imperial County from Lake Mead is called the All-American Canal.
Right.
And when you took over, it was just
an earthen canal that seeped water, so no one got the benefit of that. And so we paid millions and millions of dollars to have those canals lined, and we saved another 80,000 acre feet. And an acre foot, we talk only acre feet. An acre foot is worth 2 homes. Right. So for a year.
So that's 160,000 homes, really in the range of 500,000 people.
Right.
You bought the concrete.
We bought the concrete.
The water simply doesn't leak away anymore. The farmers get the water they always got, and San Diego gets all the extra. Right. So that's an interesting investment. And of course, you explain to your community where this water is coming from. That's growth water.
Right.
Okay, Patrick, tell us the story of New York City. Then we're gonna connect the two people on either end of this panel in a minute. But tell us the story of what you did to help New York City change its operations budget. What does it look like to find money inside your own utility?
So you already introduced the basic premise of the performance solutions model, which is essentially, as Veolia, we work with public utilities, and I would say we act as a catalyst for change. It's not the typical public-private partnership where a lot of the operational control goes to a private entity. It's really we come in as an advisor, but we don't come in as a consultant who writes a nice report that ends up on the shelf, as you said, but we actually stay around for a number of years and get very deeply involved with the implementation of the initiatives that are being identified and are being implemented jointly. And we embarked on this. It was the first big contract of its kind for us. We embarked on this in 2011 when Carter Strickland was the commissioner of the New York City DEP, who's somewhere in the audience. So if you want somebody else's opinion on that project, feel free to find him in the
Carter's going to be up here next, so if Patrick doesn't tell the truth.
Exactly. So you can. But maybe before I actually get into the details, can I get a show of hands who in this room is an engineer? Wow. All right. So very clearly water utilities and the water sector are very much dominated by engineers, and I'm one of those. But the real emphasis for us in working with a municipality like New York has been on, yes, of course, there's technical know-how, there's expertise and global best practices that a company like Veolia can bring, but our emphasis really has been much more on change management. And you already mentioned leadership. That's the first step towards change management, really thinking about how, with what is there as the system, as the equipment, as the assets, how can you, by changing how the utilities run, how individuals that are actually working in a wastewater treatment facility, that are working in to maintain the networks, they're working in customer service, how can they change their behaviors, the mindsets that underlie the behaviors to make the utility more efficient. And so we've been with the City of New York now really in what I would consider a very close partnership, a very collaborative partnership for almost 5 years. And the operating budget for the New York City utility is about $1.2 billion per year. And we're now at a point where New York City's budget has been improved by close to $100 million every year. So,
by doing what?
Right. So, $100 million of budget improvement. About half of it is additional revenue, and I can talk about a little bit where that came from. And the other half is savings. And the savings really were a very broad range of initiatives. We spent about 6 months at the beginning of the project in joint teams, so Veolia teams, New York City DEP teams, going through the entire utility operations, wastewater treatment, water supply, network operations, customer service, back office functions like fleet management and procurement and everything. There was nothing that we didn't look at really.
Nothing that was a sacred cow.
Yeah, everything was up for grabs. And together, we identified about 100 different initiatives across the entire utility operations. And all of these ideas were then turned into business cases and then over the last 4 years being implemented. And it includes about 15 million in operational performance improvements on wastewater treatment. So that's energy efficiency to a very large degree, reduction in chemical usage, improvement of biosolids handling, so dewatering, thickening improvements, none of them requiring any capital investments, just with what was there, changing the processes, changing the procedures, and changing the culture around performance management and looking and managing by numbers. Other areas included procurement. There was a comment from the audience earlier around inefficiencies of public procurement. And I think we could probably have an entire panel just talking about inefficiencies of public procurement, but it's not a God-given fact. There's things you can do, and we found about 12 million in savings just by working with the various New York City's agencies that are involved in procurement and trying to find ways helping New York City buying, for example, chemicals at a better rate, changing the contractual structures to not put all the risk on the supplier and then paying the price for it, but only putting the risk on the supplier that you need to, and then getting a better price. So very wide range of savings initiatives.
And those are just to pause before you get to the revenue, those are possible not because the people running the water utility aren't smart, aren't dedicated public servants, don't work hard. You bring a perspective from having seen lots of water systems, read dozens of contracts that the folks involved in doing it every day in New York City may not have. Is that right?
I think it's two things. Obviously, I think it's helpful to bring an outside perspective in, just a set fresh of eyes. And obviously, we are a global company. We operate many systems around the world. So if you have a problem, there's a good chance that somebody in the world from our team may have seen a similar problem. We can bring that to the table. But I think what's much more important, I already mentioned change management, is our role really in this is to be a catalyst for change. It's not Veolia's change that is changing how New York City runs the utility. It's really New York City DEP that has embarked on this operational excellence program, and we're there to support that effort. What I mean by that is most of, or a large part of the initiatives were not Veolia ideas that we convinced DEP to implement. Instead, we spend a lot of time engaging with top management, middle management, and people in the field, and enabling people to speak up, voice their ideas, bring up the ideas, and really brainstorm together with experts from our side, but really most importantly with the people in the utility to have their ideas brought up. And in the end, a lot of the things that we implemented were not ideas that didn't exist before 2011. Many of them had existed for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but there were always hurdles or reasons why they
created the setting, in fact, right?
And so the way I see our role is to help remove those hurdles, help provide the structure, help break up some of the silos that maybe stopped some of the good ideas from being implemented, and work with New York City in this case to have a structure that takes the ideas, moves them into a business case, gets them the right kind of attention at the senior leadership level, and then drive them through implementation and make sure that actually it doesn't remain an idea, but it actually becomes an improvement. Practice.
How many of the 100 ideas have been implemented?
Close to 80.
Close to 80. Okay, let's pause for 1 second. Are there some questions in the room? We've got another whole topic to cover in finance.
One over there.
Here, over here. Hang on. They like you. They want your mic, not because you don't have a big voice, but so that you're archived forever.
Thanks very much. I'm Arslan from California as well, from Silicon Valley. So you talked about that your portfolio is, your reliability is now based on diversification. Do you have any challenges now maintaining and sustaining your rates since you're sourcing water from different places? So can you talk a little bit about that? And my second question to Patrick, to you, how do you differentiate yourselves? What I'm hearing from typical management consulting companies, how do you differentiate Veolia and your organization from like Pricewaterhouse, EY, and those side of the world?
Yeah, we have raised our rates, and we've raised them quite a bit over this period of time. We've
tell the truth. You told me.
I know, we've more than doubled our rates.
Every year for 20 years in a row.
We have increased.
And she's kept her job.
And I have kept my job. And I get the Chamber of Commerce and our Economic Development Corporation to support the increase in water rates. I think what's interesting, when Patrick was talking, I was thinking about sometimes, depending on the political situation, it's critically important to have a third voice make those recommendations. It's almost like, staff could make them, but if an outside third party makes them, they must really need to be changed. And I think that's a critical, piece of our environment is the political side. And raising rates is not popular. So it is staff's and consultants' role to give the politicians the ammunition they need to be able to articulate it to their constituency. We live in a political environment, certainly, in water, and we have to accept it, and we have to, be very efficient at swimming in it.
Okay, let me just, before we take the second question, I think he might have been asking something a little more specific, which is if you have 5 sources of water, if the desal plant water is really expensive. The water from the concrete lined canal, you paid for that 10 years ago, and the water just keeps coming forever. There's water from the state water project. You pay a certain rate for that. How do you, is what you're asking, how do you figure out what you're charging when you have 5 different sources of water, all of which cost a different amount, and when you don't actually know how much desal you're going to use versus how much you're going to get from the farmers versus the state water project?
Right. Well, we do base load our 2 contracts. The desal plant is base loaded, as well as the Imperial Valley water is base loaded.
Okay.
So because
what does that tell people? What that's
base loading means that year in, year out, you're using the same amount of water from that source
at the same price. Or
at a price. And because the Bay Delta, as you know, in California is so unreliable, that really becomes our 3rd big piece that we have to, that we do not per se count on. It is not the one we count on each and every year. You have to balance reliability and cost. You know, I wouldn't want to have desalination as 100% of my supply, because it costs about another 80% higher than our cheapest water. On the other hand, what I do is I take all of the supply costs, and those are melded, and then that goes into the rates that we ultimately charge.
Okay, great.
Now, one of the things we do is we have a huge piece of our charges are fixed revenue.
So that's a little version of that. That's a version of what Kevin does.
Right.
So you've got variable rates based on how much water people use, and rates that don't change, that are based on either the size of your water meter or size of your property.
Right.
Not quite property tax, but.
Right. We have a variety of fixed charges. Our newest is called the reliability charge, which was a fixed charge. And that is to reflect the idea that it isn't the molecules that cost the most. It is the infrastructure system to make sure when you turn on your tap, your water will be there. And part of our communication with our residents and our businesses is we compare it to cable TV. If you watch only an hour of cable TV, you still pay the same monthly charge. If you watch 100 hours, you pay the same. If you leave it on 24/7. The value is in its accessibility, and that is where our water costs are. So we have a service charge. We have a variety of service charges, but that's how we talk to our community about it.
Does it actually say on my bill, reliability charge?
No, it usually says service charge, and it, depending on what retail agency ends up, how they structure it.
You're right, you're a wholesale. Right.
But most of them have a set charge and then a charge based on the amount of water you use.
But for those of you who are thinking about how to communicate, I would love it if my bill said reliability charge. There's whatever 6 different lines on my water bill, and the language is almost all acronyms, and it's completely indistinguishable.
It's
just really irritating. Right. Whereas if it simply said reliability charge, I'd have a sense. Okay, sorry, Patrick. Explain to us what's the difference between you and all these other folks. If they're, and you could say, they're good too.
If I can make one quick comment on,
sure, absolutely.
On the pricing. One thing that was recently introduced in my parents' hometown in Germany is actually a water charge depending on the size of the property and the amount of surface that is non-permeable. Mm-hmm. So if you have a large piece of land, but it's a meadow, you're not going to pay a whole lot of money for your sewer charge. But if it's a parking lot, you're going to pay a whole lot more. So I think there's a lot of innovative ways out there in the world to kind of tie the water price to what we're trying to communicate as the water industry.
And what we need to accomplish, right?
Yeah. Well, difference between what we're doing and what management consultants do, I could talk about this all day because I used to work for McKinsey, so I know both sides. But the main difference is we're, as a global company, we're not a consultant, we are an operator. So the people that will, again, you can ask Carter about the team that we had in New York, it's people that come out of our operations. So there's a different understanding, a different level of knowledge and expertise around water utility operations than you would get with a typical consulting, particularly management consulting firm who may not have the same water industry background.
There's a fairness factor to clean water. I think everyone, whether they're low income, high income, big house, small house, apartment, condo, everyone benefits from clean water to drink and a clean environment to live in. So that's what I think one of the advantages of the Milwaukee billing system is we kind of spread those costs out. You don't see those ups and downs, and everyone pays the same rate. It just depends on the value of your home or the amount of water that you
Right.
use.
It taps the fairness that we've come to associate with property taxes.
Right.
I may or may not like my property tax compared to my neighbor or the people across the street, but I understand why mine is what mine is.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take one more question at this moment. I don't know where my microphone guy is. Okay, Kat. Where's the microphone? There, hang on one second.
So I want to thank Maureen for reminding me of the need for courage and leaning in on a question that might not be so popular, but is very much as much part of this panel as it was the previous panel, and came up quite a lot last week at the One Water Summit with the U.S. Water Alliance, and I haven't seen it as much here. And just for a little context, we've been putting together a show for the Water Show of a public dialogue on Flint, and talking about it as a financial issue, talking about it as a technical issue, what happened, what didn't happen. And basically I got reamed by a good friend and leader in the Black community for not going into the racial issues associated with water. And we talked this morning about the divorce between water as technical, financial, practical, rational matter, and public health, which recognizes the public, which is diverse. And how do we as an industry continue to sort of not get in, sort of try to be colorblind, gender blind? Maureen, we've done a lot on women water leaders in the industry, Hispanic water leaders, Black water leaders, which is something to celebrate and is important when we talk about whether we're talking about finance, whether we're talking about health, to show different faces, to have different diversity in leadership, as well as recognizing the diversity in the population we're serving. So, and frankly, I'm not seeing the same diversity that we had in Atlanta here, which Milwaukee is a diverse city. So, how do we deal with issues of race and equity and affordability? How are we not getting that more into the conversation when we're communicating about all of the issues that we're talking about today?
I think when you are talking about social justice and issues is, as Kevin said earlier, water quality, no matter race, creed, sexual orientation, it is from a public agency standpoint, our community, my 3.2 million people have put trust in us. And it doesn't matter what color their face may be, that is a trust that has the same value no matter who it is. And I guess from the operational standpoint, we look at communities as a whole. Now in California, we're so different in California for a variety of reasons, some good, some not so good. I have the luxury, being the agency that serves the entire region, to be able to, I guess, break down those individual neighborhood issues where you do ensure quality to everyone. But you raised a really good point, and that's affordability. And that is something we're struggling mightily with right now, certainly in California. We have a proposition that was approved by the population several years ago. We've got the initiative process in California. And this is one that says we are not allowed to charge more than the actual cost of the service. And so that has put a huge barrier in front of all of the water agencies in California of how to deal with low income and affordability issues for the very needy, because we're technically not allowed to charge others more, so we can charge that population
It's this
less.
debate over whether tiered rates are legal in California. That is, can you charge somebody with 2 acres of golf course green quality grass more for using that kind of water than you can an ordinary family of 4 in a 2-bedroom house? That's a real struggle.
And that's probably our greatest struggle now from a financial standpoint, and a standpoint that impacts our low-income neighborhoods, which often are people of color. And so we are going through a variety of ideas on how to not violate the technical law, but to be able to provide some, it is creative rate structures that don't violate the existing law.
You know, it's a moment of great opportunity. Everybody in this room works in some kind of water-related organization. The numbers I've heard over the last couple of years is that in the next 5 years, half the people who run water systems in the United States will reach retirement age. And what that means is it's a great moment for bringing in the next generation of people who are going to run and ultimately lead those water organizations. And it is certainly a great moment to diversify the perspectives, and the water business benefits tremendously from diversity of perspective. That's, that's what part of what we heard this morning was when you stop regarding wastewater as a waste product and start regarding it as a resource, that's a diversity of perspective. And so I think everybody who lives and works in this world has, in some sense, the obligation, first of all, to let people in high school and college know, if you want a job in a world that's going to transform itself and transform the world, water is a pretty great place to do that, and there'll be jobs available. And also to make sure that that recruiting isn't along very, very predictable lines, that you tap all kinds of folks. So, okay.
I think one of the reasons we're at where we're at on the wastewater side is it's been driven by regulatory guidance, and the regulations have said on the wastewater side, you're going to have a certain effluent quality come out of your water reclamation facilities. You're going to try to stop all overflows. So it's always been on the downstream end of the discussion. Here in Milwaukee, we've pretty much addressed all of those issues, and now we're starting to move upstream into the networks and into the neighborhoods. And, we got hit with a storm July 2010 that hit the poorest part of Milwaukee and some of the suburbs. And what you find in those areas, it's not only the poorest, but the infrastructure is in the worst condition as well. So here's a wonderful opportunity for us to invest dollars in those neighborhoods to improve their living, their ability to live where they live without having water in their basements, to improve their quality of life, put them to work, train those folks as well, and then make sure that they have other opportunities afterwards. And that's one of the things we're working on right now.
Good, that's good to hear. So, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on a couple things Magda mentioned in the earlier panel. What are we doing to do that training? And again, it's an obligation of the leaders in the water industry to come up with programs other than just saying, hey, there'll be jobs for you in the future. What are we doing to train young people to get them interested? And if you don't have a program of internships or apprenticeships or what have you, then
Kids go to law school because they work at law firms over the summer.
that's right. And so you've really got to start thinking about how are we going to replace the baby boomers, and implementing these type of outreach activities where kids are interested in water and willing to do that.
It's part of that communication plan that you talked about
Yeah.
earlier. You really have to get out there early in 4th grade, 5th grade, start talking about what we do,
Right.
because they don't know.
Okay, we're gonna change ponies, sort of. One of the things I've heard a lot about is private-public partnerships, PPPs. I've never really understood how they worked until I talked to Kevin and Patrick. Kevin, it turns out, has another little operational secret. He employs Patrick to run his wastewater system, not directly. But go ahead and tell the room about the fact that you use a PPP, and then we want to hear literally the economics. Why does it matter that you don't do it yourself?
Well, in 1997, and this is before I got to the district, the commission decided they wanted to privatize the operation. So we issued a 10-year contract to a firm to come in and operate and maintain the system. Now you hear about public-private partnerships a lot. You hear about the failures of those partnerships. A lot of that failure is the way that initial agreement is set up. The way we set ours up is we still own all of the assets. So the pipes, the pumps, the doors, the windows, the roofs, we own everything. We maintain ownership of that. I have engineers and planners that we employ a lot of consultants that help us manage that capital investment. So we are entirely doing the capital on our own. We hired 2 different firms. The first firm went from 1998 to 2008. We put it out for public bid in 2007, and we selected Veolia Water, now Veolia Water Milwaukee, to operate since 2008 forward. If you read the papers here in the last 2 weeks, you'll have seen that we're asking the commission to approve a 10-year extension on the Veolia contract as well. So the thing that's different about us is Veolia operates the system, they maintain the system. When it comes to an overflow, I'm the one that makes the phone call on that, so we still maintain that responsibility. And it's a really good partnership because we bring a global partner, bringing all these technology ideas to us, and we also benefit from their operation. How does this save us money? When we turned over the system in 1998, February 1998, we turned over plus or minus 290 employees for them to operate the system and maintain the system with. Right now, Veolia is operating somewhere around 220 employees.
Okay.
And we had a requirement in the contract that they could not fire people, but it would be through attrition. So through that 18 years that we've had operation, both 2 different companies, we've been able to work through the staffing issues. And if you saw today's paper, you'll see that the unions came out in support of the extension with Veolia.
Okay, if I'm a customer of yours, though, what I would think is you've brought in an outside company to do a job the government's been doing. They promised to cut costs. The way you cut costs is cut corners. How do you prevent casting nosebleeds? How do you prevent whoever the private operator is from making their money by not operating it the way you would? And why are they able to be more efficient than you are?
So we have a contract compliance office. It's probably 10 people that oversee the contract. So that they're looking at all of the different contractual relationships.
So
we oversee them.
You specify what they have to do.
Exactly.
And you told me some things about the numbers. You actually build in.
So for the permit, it's really technical. If you can hear me, there we go. For the permit, we're required to have biochemical oxygen demand in total suspended solids below 30 milligrams per liter each. So that's the permit level. With the contract, we've required 15 milligrams per liter. So they're twice as good as what the state and federal government requires us to be. We have other indicators like that as well. So we've put some pretty high marks into the contract for them to try to meet, and they have met them. They've exceeded, done much better than those numbers. They're operating in the 10s instead of the 15s.
So you require them to actually do better than what you yourselves would be required to do, which eliminates which creates a cushion for this cutting corners issue. And why can a company like Veolia be more efficient than you?
Well, that may be a question for Veolia, but I can tell you the first company lost $60 million in 10 years, so they lost money.
Okay.
In the contract. We saved $165 million over that same first 10-year period.
That's not a sustainable business model.
No. And so now the second contract, which Veolia has operated in 2007, we estimated that we would save an additional $35 million. So the savings are smaller because we've already kind of tightened up the efficiencies. We think we're on line to save that $35 million.
But you mentioned a couple reasons that a company can be more efficient than a utility.
Well, one of them was the staffing that I talked about, but they can buy chemicals on the open market, so they can go out and buy chemicals at a larger volume, lower rate than we can. They don't have some of the procurement requirements that we have to try to go through public procurement. We do require that they still help us meet our small women and minority business enterprise hiring goals, but they're able to more efficiently do some of those management.
You even mentioned healthcare, which I thought was interesting.
In healthcare as well. So we've been able on the healthcare side. We turned over 290. Now they operate at 220. But of those 220 employees, I think about 41 of them are former MSD employees from 1997. So the rest of them are now on a private healthcare system run by Veolia. So we don't have that healthcare cost anymore in that 180 or so employees. And then every year more people retire, and so eventually it'll become a completely private operation, a private healthcare. And that long-term lead item that a lot of us look at for the future of healthcare hits you, when folks age. We've got a horizon on that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll take a couple questions from the audience. We may go over a little bit for those who want to at noon. I want a quick answer to a hard question, and here it is. When I am at events like this or talking to people in the water world and I say, you need to communicate better, one of the things that people push back on immediately is that they are criticized for spending money explaining how the water system works. Hey, I have a way you can cut my rates. Cut out the TV ads and the bill inserts and all this. You don't need to talk to me about my water. And yet, what we heard for an hour this morning and what we've heard from all three of you is you need to communicate better. So, Maureen, Kevin, when you make that effort, which isn't free, in fact, although there are imaginative ways of doing it, and it's got to be an ongoing effort. It can't be a one-off effort. What's your response when people say, I got an idea how to cut the water bill?
If your first move is ads, you probably are not going to be as successful as you could.
Okay.
So it really is, you got to start from the ground up. And last year alone, just the manager's office did over 260 presentations to community groups.
Public meetings.
Well, not formal
Not
public.
formal public meetings.
No, but it's the joke is, if there's a moose, an elk, or a lion, there's 5 of them in a room, the water authority probably will make a presentation to them.
Okay.
The idea of you've got to start at a base level. You can't build.
That's one, and 260 is one a day, basically.
Yeah.
50 weeks times 5 days.
Right. You can't expect these mass mailings to do much good. That's not communicating with your community, that's talking to.
That's communicating with the recycling bin.
Yeah, so it's a one-way communication, and you've got to get out there and hear back from them, which initially can be very scary, and you will get people who are very angry with you, and you've got to work it through. Again, it goes to that leadership and courage. You've got to be willing to be out there and be truth-telling. And so we have a variety of ways we communicate. Clearly, we have a website that's extremely robust, and we're on social media. As probably most of you are, the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Instagram and some other things that under 40 knows about, but I don't. You've got to get out there at all different levels. We have a robust, nationally award-winning education program. We are in elementary schools, junior high schools, colleges. I talked about the apprenticeship and intern programs. We, guest speak at a variety of educational, but then you
tell me you also work with Lowe's and Home Depot?
Oh, well, that's on, we're focused on outdoor water conservation.
Right.
And so the issue is, rather than just talking to a homeowner about, stop sprinkling your lawn, and remember, we average between 5 and 8 inches of rain a year. So everybody, waters property on a regular basis.
I have 32 inches of rain.
He's got rain events that are more than you get in a year.
Yeah, I think this year we were just about 5 inches. And it doesn't rain for 6 months between April and October. We just don't get rain. So what we decided is you can't just talk to the homeowner. That's not going to work. So we ended up coming up with clusters that we felt were critically important. If you want water conservation, and for us, we want to change out lawns that aren't being utilized with more California-friendly or drought-tolerant landscaping. So we decided to do a cluster focus, which is landscape architects. We actually have a program with them, educate them on what's needed. Landscape maintenance companies that come out and maintain lawn yards, on a weekly basis. They normally do not get paid to save water. They get paid to make your lawn and your yard look beautiful. So we had to educate them on sprinklers and opportunities to conserve evapotranspiration controllers, things like that. Then we went to homeowner. We have really robust classes where they actually can design their own makeover in their yard. We have it on the web where they can do it either by video. But then we had to go to the nurseries. So if I educate the homeowner and they now want to buy drought tolerant plants, but they go to Home Depot or Lowe's and they're not there, those plants, they buy a rose bush and stick it in. So what we did is we've partnered with Lowe's, Home Depot, and all of our large nurseries in San Diego County. And we actually do plant fairs there. Plus they have committed on an ongoing basis to actually inventory California-friendly plants and identify them as drought-tolerant plants. It is that circle of outdoor landscaping life that you've got to go at. You can't just go at pieces.
But and that's all actually part of a communication strategy.
That's part of our
in the end, right? If you're doing 260 events a year, but you're also talking to Lowe's and Home Depot, because if you talk over here and there's no connection over here, then it doesn't accomplish anything.
Right.
Okay.
Can I make
Sure,
a quick comment?
absolutely.
I think there's also I think as the water industry, we can be quite confident in this as well. I don't think there's a need really to get too deeply into justifying communication. And the reason I'm saying this is you just have to look at the growth of the bottled water market. Bottled water is several hundred, if not 1,000 times more expensive than the water that we provide at the tap. When has a Nestle customer ever gone to Nestle and said, make my bottled water cheaper and cut out the advertising? I think there's a certain level of confidence that we as the industry can have and say, that's part of what we do, that's part of our relationship with the customer, just like advertising is for any private entity that's selling bottled water.
But also the cost of talking to you is trivial compared to the value. And you, sir, may well understand, but lots of people don't. And so we appreciate you wanting us to pay attention to that cost. I've heard the yelling from people about, and it's out of scale to the, yeah, I'm sure you have. Okay, let's take some questions. Are there any questions? All the way in the back in front of the camera, there's somebody right there. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Ronnie Averick from Global Waterworks. And first of all, thank you to the panel. I really appreciate your passion for these water issues. Maureen, I'm so glad that you brought up talking to the landscape industry and so on. My question is, are there any other economic disruptions that you see in the water-related markets where things that might be more efficient economically to create better water stewardship might be putting someone else out of business for some reason, or lessening their business, or making them have to refocus their business? And has that been a challenge? And for all three of you, are there any areas specifically where you've seen that?
Yeah, it has been a challenge, and it was a challenge during the big drought of '91 when the cuts were coming. We basically, between that and the focus on changing out landscaping, the sod farms have pretty much gone away in our region. I mean, there's a few left, but it fundamentally changed the economics for them when, you don't have new homes putting them in. You don't have people refreshing their yards. However, we have created tremendous increase in the businesses related to conservation. Both, we do free conservation audits, in home, commercial, industrial, that has blossomed. Also the fixtures, we've created a market for water saving fixtures and change outs of whether it be appliances, your plumbing, and what have you. So there's a lot of change, I think, that's going on in the water industry, the related water industry, and it's just part of life.
On the wastewater side, in 2002, we started looking at issues from a watershed approach, not just my sewer area or a city or a municipality, but from a watershed approach. And when you step back and put that lens on it, you start looking with the landscapers for urban landscaping, development of yards and so forth. But you also, in our case, move upstream and you look at agriculture. And I think I've got a lot of friends that are farmers. They're doing some really good stuff. I think we just need to expand that discussion with them, because I do think there's an economic model where we can help them do better at their job. We can financially help them do better at their job. And we can also reduce
the impact.
Reduce pollution into the waterways. So I think that's cheaper than making some wastewater utility go in and remove phosphorus down to 0.00 whatever. I think there's other approaches, thinking outside the box on these things. And I just think that's the way the industry is moving. I think that's something we have to do, because if you don't look at these other approaches and you think of it as a watershed as opposed to just your utility, you're just going to keep pouring more money into some requirement that really doesn't have an impact on the environment. Let's put our money where we have a bigger bang for the buck.
Great. Let's take one more question. Yes, sir. Hang on. Before you leave, I want Patrick to tell one final story. It'll take him 2 minutes. So let's take this question, and I want you to tell the water meter story. Okay. I know too much about what these guys know. Go ahead, sir. Tell us who you are.
Okay. Okay, Andy Erdum with representing IACA Remote Water Monitoring Solutions. My question is, you guys, especially for Patrick, the engineer, I've worked in a technical field for almost 30 years, worked with lots of engineers. There's a lot of different industries that are competing for engineering talent today. And I've been involved in internships, FIRST Robotics and things like that. So my point is, you're also looking at the emergence of IoT technology. And some companies are actually taking big data and taking a human factor out of control, doing monitoring control automatically, which will reduce the need for potentially some operators in wastewater and water. So my question is, what do you think the impact of technology, specifically IoT, is going to have on your field?
I guess there's, in a half sentence, you mentioned the competition for talent. I actually wanted to make a comment on this first, which is, I think in the water industry, and as Veolia, we're in the water waste and energy space, and if that's how I go to try to recruit the best talent, I may not be all that successful competing with the Googles and Facebooks and so forth of the world for the best engineering talent. But once you start talking about the water industry, or also the waste industry, the energy industry, as being a real part of the making the world a more resilient, a more sustainable, and more livable place, and appeal to those kinds of aspects of our industry, I think that's something that really speaks to the millennial generation, who don't just want to work, but also actually want to work to do something that's meaningful. And I think that's something we're trying to do. In terms of how technology, IoT, is going to change the industry, I think that the trends will probably, and it's kind of looking at a crystal ball, but I think that the trends will be consistent with what's happening in the rest of the industry, that certainly there will be some kind of displacement of what is now maybe manual labor with some through technologies. But I think it's really more a question of maybe what used to be low skilled will be upskilled, and operating a system will require a different way of working rather than replacing it. I don't expect, there be an employee-free water utility anytime soon that's completely run by, IBM's Watson computer somewhere out of a cloud-based computing system. But yes, there will be changes. But in the end, the changes really then still depend on, if you implement a new technology in water utility, I think the big change will be just how the work will be reorganized, and it will change the nature of the work.
Okay, do us a favor. Before you guys scatter, you're going to want to hear this story. We didn't get to it, but one of the 100 ideas was the large water meter replacement. Just tell that in 2 minutes. Give us the numbers and the point.
And I'd actually like to tie that story to the question from Kat, I think is the name, around affordability and fairness.
Sure.
Because especially if you look at urban water systems, what you'll find is that a very small number of very large customers tends to make up for a really big amount of the revenue that comes in. The numbers in New York,
and the water that gets used.
And the water gets used exactly for the consumption. So if I take the New York example, it's then I know the numbers relatively well. It's about 8% of the 8% largest customers account for over 35% of the revenue of the utility. And so one of the 100 initiatives was to focus specifically on the largest accounts. New York City has about 700,000 to 800,000 metered accounts. We looked at the top 50,000 of those accounts, and we worked with the city of New York to identify those accounts where the meters were inaccurate, in order to make sure that those largest consumers that make up the bulk of the consumption actually get billed for the water that they are consuming. And so the program was ran over about a 2.5 year period. Over that time period, about 26,000 out of those 50,000 meters were replaced. The program was prioritized by return on investment, so through sampling, meter testing, statistical analysis using the AMI data that was available, we, together with New York City, developed a prioritized structured replacement program that basically went after those accounts first that would create the biggest impact, increased revenue. And the result now, after 3 years of having run through the program, is over 40 million in additional revenue every year. And
because the water meters were inaccurate.
They were inaccurate.
Okay, and answer one question, then we'll let everybody go to lunch. My favorite question is, how do you explain to a customer that their water bill is about to go up by 8% because the water meter's been inaccurate? I like the old water meter, Patrick. So you guys have a great response to this.
We spend a lot of time initially in the program thinking about stakeholder engagement, communication strategy. How do we deal actually with that question? Because obviously it's not going to be a popular thing. You get a meter replaced, all of a sudden your water bill is higher. There were a few things that were done that helped mitigate that issue. The first one was, it was essentially forgiveness, meaning, okay, we know your water meter has been inaccurate for a number of years now, but we're not going to back bill you for those years. So that's on us.
The good news.
So that's on the utility. The other one is, in the end, we expected a significant number of complaints. 26,000 large water meters replaced. It's probably a few handful of customers that actually went back to New York City DEP and complained, a very, very tiny amount. And the reason for that is it really was the very large commercial accounts. It's the big residential blocks, the big commercial buildings in Manhattan, very, very large, typically very professionally managed buildings. They all have building managers. And we don't know for a fact, but our interpretation of the very small number of complaints from the customer side was most of those customers knew their water meter was inaccurate. They kind of saw it coming, and they may have even had some financial reserves to be ready to, once the utility came out, replacing it. So it wasn't, it's a different story when if you were doing this kind of program for single family homes, and you're talking about individuals or families, especially at a lower income spectrum. But that's not the focus, and that's actually not where you get the return on investment anyway. The return on investment is going after the big accounts that make up for most of the consumption.
In defense of inaccurate water meters, as a guy who manufactures most of those water meters, okay, you have to understand that water meters in America around the world have historically been mechanical water meters. They have moving parts in them. Over time, those parts will wear down. A water meter cannot overcharge you. It can only undercharge given time. So a brand new meter, when installed, is accurate at 100%. After about 20 years, it's probably only recording about 90% of the water, maybe even 85% of the water going through it. A lot of utilities, in order to save costs, delay replacing their water meters, okay? We encourage them to replace them much earlier for the obvious reason. But interestingly, a few years ago, Badger Meter and several of our competitors have introduced electronic water metering using magnetic or ultrasonic technology with no moving parts, which will hold their accuracy throughout their life. So that's how we're resolving it.
The 40 million, by the way, comes to $100 a month per customer about.
Right.
So it wasn't a brutal.
And when you're talking about the Empire State Building, you know, when you're talking about big customer users, it isn't that noticeable. But you are right about one thing. If somebody knocks on your door from the water department, is Carrie Lewis here, by the way? I didn't know.
Yes.
There she is. If Carrie knocks on your door and says, hey, we'd like to put in a brand new water meter, slam the door, lock it, and hide behind the couch, okay? Because your old water meter is probably only billing you for about 90% of the water going through it.
And what I learned is they always go inaccurate in the direction of charging less.
Correct.
Which is really interesting.
By
They
design.
they default to charging less rather than charging more.
That's right, by design.
Ladies and gentlemen, lunch is
Well, I do
served
have
in
a few
here. You're
comments
gonna do
before
it? Okay, you do it,
everybody.
okay.
Okay, because I have to ask a couple more trivia questions, all right? So trivia question number one under the category of bad beer is that in 1900, a river's flow was reversed, creating the largest diversion out of the Great Lakes in the history of the United States. What river was diverted? The Chicago River, that's right. And what they did was they were dumping their sewage in the Chicago River, and it was flowing out into Lake Michigan, and that was causing cholera and problems with the water intakes. So in the greatest feat of engineering since Roman aqueducts, they reversed the flow of the Chicago River so that all their sewage went down the Chicago River, Illinois River, Mississippi River, stops in St. Louis, and gets made into the worst beer in the world, okay? If you think that special taste in Budweiser is from Beechwood aging, it's digested Chicago Red Hots. That's what's right. You think about that next time you opt for a St. Louis beer instead of a Milwaukee beer. And then the second trivia question under the category of well, I don't know whether to put this under the category of irony or horny teenagers, but they both work, okay? Under the category of irony, we'll call it. The Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, was in Chicago in 1893 before they reversed the flow of the river. They were very worried about their water supply, so they decided to tap water, run a pipeline from a city in the United States that had the best water in the United States. In fact, people believed that water could cure a lot of diseases. So Chicago's plan was to run a pipeline from what U.S. city? Waukesha, Wisconsin, right? And where the horny teenager comes into play in this is they didn't really get Waukesha's permission. They loaded up a bunch of pipe and men on train cars, went up to Waukesha, planning to start digging trenches. The people of Waukesha found out, came out in force with pitchforks and guns, and told them if one pipe gets taken off their train car, there would be bloodshed. The men loaded the back up on the train car, pulled out of town about 10 miles, waited till 2 in the morning, came back into town, and started laying the pipe. Fortunately, there was a young man who had snuck out of his house for a rendezvous with a young lady, different kind of pipe laying, and he was coming back home when he heard all the noise, and he raised the alarm. They grabbed their guns again, and this time they chased them off for good. So Chicago never did get the Waukesha water that they wanted. So kind of a little side story there. Well, we will reconvene. Oh, by the way, lunch will be in here, I believe. I'm looking for Megan or somebody. Lunch will be in here, right, at 12:30. Thank you. And we will be reconvening at 1 o'clock. So thank you very much, and we'll see you back in here. Thank you to our panel.
Very good. So,